Patterson took a film of a female hominoid walking along a creek bank in 1967, October. You all saw this, well, not all, but some of you saw this recently on a television program called World's Greatest Hoaxes. All right? That itself was a hoax. That program was a hoax. I wrote a long email about this, and it's on my site if you'd like to read it, www.lloydpie.com. It's a defense of the Patterson film showing what they did not talk about in that program, trying to make this film look like a hoax and pick on it, as people will do occasionally. There's no doubt that this is a bona fide film for a number of reasons we're going to go over. All right. First of all, it was a bright sunny day, as you can see. What happened was the sun was shining such that it was glinting off of her shoulder and thigh as she walked, and you could see her muscles rippling in her shoulder, in her thigh as she walks. In good slow-mo close-up, you can see that, which they did not provide in that program. All right. If that's a person in a suit, the suit has to be glued to naked skin. In the gluing process, you lose that flexibility, that ripple. The only thing that looks like this does in this film is real skin over real muscle working. So we could stop right here. It's real just based on that. Right there. But we don't have to stop. The arm, if you've all seen her walk, she walks along like this. She drags her arm down around her knees where everybody says, you know, the hominoids do. Why? The elbow articulates right here, which is much longer from shoulder to elbow than a human. If that's a human in a suit, impossible. You can't get an elbow bend at the same point. So we could stop right there. Solid proof that that's not a human being in a suit. But furthermore, Jerry Romney, the guy they said was in the suit, they stuck him with breasts. What would they do that for? Why go to the problem? Why go to the trouble? As she walks along and she turns back to face him, you see the breasts sway, and she takes a couple of steps, and you see that nice jiggle that we all know. If it's a person in a suit in 1967, it's going to be those early silicone jobs. Remember those? Absolutely real right there. Furthermore, she left tracks in the hard-packed sand of the creek bed. 1 inch deep. We have pictures, we have casts. That cast you saw earlier of the cast in the foot, that was her foot. No question, inch deep, walked a 200-pound man beside her not long after. He sank about 1/4 of an inch. So we know that as she stood there doing this, she weighed 600 to 800 pounds. Fake that. That's got to be a real lead-lined suit. 600 to 800 pounds as she walks. So we know that it was a legitimate film. Furthermore, as they pointed out in the program, with the fake films, they can never tell you where it happened and who did it, who took it, because they don't want that guy to be grilled, and they don't want experts to go and measure one limb here and know how tall it really was. Well, what Patterson did was he went right out fast as he could and begged every expert in the area that he could call, every anthropologist and zoo person, come out, bona fide sighting, please bring dogs. And you don't want to bring dogs because these things have a very powerful body odor that even tracking dogs will recoil from. If it's a person in a suit, it's like the suit's not even there. The dogs are after it. Patterson did, of course, no expert came. Needless to say, they never do. You can't get them to go because they know what will happen. A young man named Grover Krantz went out early in his career as an anthropologist, took a look at one, and he said, it looks real to me. And it's 30-some-odd years later, and I think he's still trying for tenure. They've made a tremendous example out of Grover Krantz for what happens to people who side with the enemy in this issue, which is a very volatile, very sensitive issue. Okay? So no experts would come, needless to say. Patterson did everything right that he could except film something that could be real. Other than that, he was great. Okay, next slide. Man named Albert Ostman, picture taken in 1957, talking about an event that occurred to him 33 years earlier in 1924 when he was a young man, a timber cruiser in the woods of southern British Columbia. He's taking some time off. He's out looking for gold mines, lost gold mines. He's sleeping in his sleeping bag one night, and suddenly Big Hand picks him up, shoves him to the bottom of the bag, slings him over its back like Santa's bag of toys, and scoops up his camp stores with the other hand and walks off with him. He is captured by a Bigfoot. He has marched for about an hour. He's got barely enough room at the top of the bag to breathe. The hand couldn't get quite around the bag, so he had enough room to breathe, but he's stuck down the bottom of it. It dumps him out an hour later or so, and he's in a 10-acre basin of high rock walls where he can't get out, and there's one opening opposite where he is, and over there is the den of the living quarters of the male Bigfoot that got him, his mate, and their two offspring, a young male and a young female. And Albert Ostman stays with them for 6 days before he can figure out a way to escape, which is very funny, very clever. Not going to go into it. Takes too long to tell. It's in the book, okay? But he gets away. The point of the story is not how funnily he escapes, but that he doesn't tell anybody for 33 years. Keeps it to himself, thinking everybody would think he was crazy, which they would do. And then in 1957, he reads an affidavit in a paper by a man who saw one picking berries, and the man said, if anybody has an experience like this, would you share it with me? So Ostman writes him a letter and says, this is what happened to me. Well, when people found out what happened to him, the roof fell in on the poor guy. Experts came in from all over the world. He had to take lie detector tests up the wazoo. You know how it works. And so you know that when you're telling a story, a long, detailed story, and it's a lie, you can't keep the details straight. You're going to goof it up, and they're going to figure it out sooner or later you're telling a lie. He never goofed up. He passed all his lie detector tests. No, anybody that had anything to do with him, just read the testimonies, say he was absolutely A+ straight-up guy, telling a true story. Next slide. The famous Minnesota Iceman. Ice Child is more like it. This was a juvenile Bigfoot killed by a man named Frank Hansen in the woods of northern Minnesota. Ironically, in 1967, the same year that Patterson filmed his Bigfoot 2,000 miles away. All right, now, Frank Hansen shot it in the back, blew out that nice hole in its chest, dropped it, severed its spine, dropped it down. It pulled its arm up to protect its face from him, as you can imagine, shot it through the wrist, through the left eye, blew the right eye out onto its cheek, and blew out the back of its head. Coup de grace, killed it dead. At that moment, 1967, Frank Hansen could have changed history. He could have taken this thing, crammed it down the throats of science, and we would not be having this discussion today. We would all accept hominoids as a reality from that point forward. No problem. But Frank Hansen was not that kind of man. The kind of man he was, he saw the opportunity. He bought a 7-foot floor freezer. He threw the body in there. He filled it up with water. He froze it. He put a piece of plate glass over it, and he took it around to shopping malls and county fairs for about 12 years, from about 1978 to, about 1968 to about 1980. Did anybody here besides me see it when it was out? There's always people that saw it. Okay, so they can tell you that it was the real deal. Okay? Now, what you saw if you went and paid your buck to see it was this thing laid out, and you could see it's kind of snowy, milky ice right here, but where you could see it was like glass. It was like air. It was clear. You know how ice can be. So, you could see very clearly that this was an living dead thing laying in front of you. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of a man named Ivan Sanderson. When Frank Hansen was trying to get publicity for this, he allowed Ivan Sanderson, a true zoologist and a great cryptozoologist, to study this thing for 3 full days. Very powerful lights, the whole works, and Sanderson wrote this tremendously detailed technical report about it, much of which I quote in the book. You read that, you will know the man knew what he was looking at from a technical zoology standpoint. I'm looking at it just with layman's eyes when I'm a young man, but they're perfect eyes, astronaut eyes. So I'll tell you what I saw. What you could see, what anybody could see, because the knees were almost to the top of the glass, is that every hair, you know how hair floats in water? This is not our hair, this is primate hair, 2 to 3 inches long. It's sticking off, it's like a pincushion off its body. You can see right down to its skin wherever you look. And wherever you look, you're looking at what amounts to a small pencil lead hair, round, tucking into a pore, perfectly tightly round. Wherever you look, millions of them, wherever you look. Now, what we're told is this was just a wax and rubber dummy made up by a charlatan who was out to just take advantage of people, right? Ask anybody who works in the wax museum business, and they'll tell you the one thing you can't do well is hair, because to get the hair right, you got to punch it in with a tool, and you got to pull that tool out, and it's going to leave a little nick mark around the hair. None of that in this creature, none. But the thing that really impressed me the most, and I'm sure everybody else will verify this, is, you know, when you kill a deer or something, you let it bleed out, but for a long time after, it oozes that pink kind of fluid. You scrape your elbow, for women who don't deer hunt, scrape your elbow, you know, and after a while you're still oozing that pink sticky stuff. Well, it was still doing that when he froze it, when he put the water in. So as the water was freezing, that stuff was coming up in tendrils, ribbons, pink ribbons of that sticky, oozy stuff, coming out of every wound, out of there, out of the mouth, out of the nose. You know, when you have a traumatic head injury, you bleed out of your nose and your mouth as well, out of both eye sockets, out of the wrist. Little pieces of bone were sticking out of the wrist. Every one of those, and those ribbons went from down as deep in the holes as they could get up to the surface, and they spread out in little pools, little circles at the top of the ice. Now, I defy anybody making a fake to even think to do that, much less pull it off and make it look so real. This is Alma, the living Neanderthal. This is one of them right here. This is Xana, is an Alma, was an Alma. Now, understand this. In the Orient, the tradition when one of these things is captured, for whatever reason, was to kill it immediately, desiccate its body and sell its body parts for medicine, principally aphrodisiacs. That's the Oriental tradition. In the Russian area, though, when they would be captured, male or female, they would be used as slaves, physical slaves, held, spirits broken in these primitive villages where they would be, and they would be used to carry wood, fetch water, do the haying, all the heavy work nobody really wants to do. Make the slave do it. And so that became their fate. And for females, another aspect of it was they had to become the sex slaves of the men of the area. And that was one of the other great advantages to having a female. And so this is the fate that befell Xana in about 1850. She was captured as an adult in 1850. We do not know how old she was. She was an adult. She was taken to the village of Tequina, where they kept her in a hole for about 3 years until her spirit was broken enough to let her wander around. She was dependent on them for food, and then they began to train her to fetch wood, fetch water, do the things that she had to do. And she became like the village pet for 40 years. She died in 1890. Now, how do we know this? Because in the Orient and Russia, they don't have the same tradition that we have. They're very old countries. They've been living with this for a very long time, for centuries. They know they're real. They send researchers out taking information about it. They send teams out trying to find them. Well, they used to when Russia had money. They don't now. But this was done in the mid-1970s. Excuse me, I'm sorry, mid-1960s. This research was done in the mid-60s. So, in the mid-1960s, this is an area of Kazakhstan where she lived, where people live very long lives. You know those places in the world where people live up around 120 years old? So they had over 100 people above the age of 80 that had known her quite well in their youth. There were 10 still alive who had attended her funeral. So they were able to get tremendous corroborative evidence, corroborative testimony about her lifestyle, and everything about her from all these different people, so we have an amazing view of what she was like and what her life was like. Again, a lot of which I go over in the book. But the main thing is that she never learned to speak, but she learned the language. They could talk to her and she'd know what they meant. And while there, she gave birth 8 times to hybrids with men of the village. 8 times. Killed the first 4 accidentally because her kind apparently washes the newborn off immediately. She would take it to the freezing glacial river that ran through the village, and because they had so much human in them, it would kill them. So the last 4, the village women took them from her at birth and raised them on their own because they looked so human. And every pair of hands was very valuable in one of those primitive villages like that. And so they raised them up, and they became Russian citizens. Married, had children. Her great-grandchildren are alive in Russia to this day. I know, it's an amazing story. Now, what do people say about her children? Well, everybody said that they were indeed taller than most, bigger than most, a little more robust than most, but not giants, not superhumans, just strong, you know, big and strong people. Darker skinned than most, but not truly Negroid. hair like, you know, everybody, but not covered in hair like she was. Average intelligence, not wizards, not stupid. Ugly enough to make a freight train take a dirt road. Unfortunately for them. But they could speak. That's the key. They could all speak. They had very high-pitched voices, but they could speak, which allowed them to integrate into the community as humans, even though they were clearly not quite humans. So the researchers were real excited to get all this information. It's like, wow. And they knew where she was buried. She was buried in the village cemetery. Unfortunately, this is a Muslim area. They don't mark gravestones there. So they knew she was in the village cemetery, which had existed for centuries, and they couldn't say just where, because of the 10 people that were alive, they all had different memories of where it had been. Who knew that 70, 80 years later somebody was going to care? So they couldn't decide. They couldn't, and they would have had to bulldoze the whole thing. The village wouldn't let them do that. So somebody says, well, guess what? Her youngest son, Kvit, died in 1954, only 10 years prior to this study. So they said, we know where he is. We'll let you dig him up. So, boy, they dug him up. Her youngest son, Kvit. Now, before we look at his skull, I want to say again, remember, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we did, and they carry them, we do rather, than they carry them in a bun in the back of their head called the occipital bun. All right, let's take a look at Kvit's skull. Here you go, right here. Notice, if you will, that's a remnant of an occipital bun right there. Notice how much of a forehead he doesn't have. Look at the size of these brow ridges. Look at that eye socket. Is it starting to look familiar? Look at the size of that nasal passage. Look at the size of these teeth. Look at the size of that jawbone. Look at the size of the cheekbone. But look at that chin. Allows him to speak. This is an ugly dude, kids. This is a Neanderthal, basically. This is a guy you do not want to meet in a dark alley. Now, what, of course, anthropologists say is that he is an extreme variation on the human norm. An extreme, real extreme variation on the human norm. But that's how they explain it. Okay, I ask you to take my word for it. Hominoids are real. They live with us today. They have always lived with us. It is their planet. They are the native, indigenous, upright walking primate of planet Earth. There was a split somewhere between the down on all four primates and the up on 2 feet primates, but we're not the one. The prehumans are the prehominoids. Go with me on that. Now, if you do, what it means is, as I said earlier, we human beings do not have a place in the natural scheme of life on Earth.